the prophecy that forbade us to love. The first time I saw her, I already knew how she would die, not because someone had told me, not because I had dreamed it in the fevered twilight between waking and sleeping, not because any oracle had descended from whatever realm oracles descend from to deliver warnings wrapped in riddles and dressed in metaphor, but because the prophecy had always been there, quiet and patient and utterly certain of itself, written into the architecture of my thoughts long before she entered my life, long before I understood that some knowledge arrives not through learning but through inheritance, passed down through channels that have nothing to do with blood or genetics or any of the mechanisms biology uses to ensure continuity. Her name was Alara. She stood across the train platform on a Thursday evening in October, rain clinging to her coat like the world itself was trying to hold her back, like the weather had conspired with forces I couldn't name to create resistance between us, to slow down the moment when our eyes would meet. And something ancient inside me would shift with the weight and certainty of a lock, turning when the right key finally finds it, after centuries of waiting in the wrong hands. The platform was crowded with commuters carrying briefcases and umbrellas, and the particular exhaustion that accumulates in bodies that have spent too long doing work that doesn't matter. But I saw only her, standing perfectly still in the chaos of movement, her dark hair plastered to her forehead by the rain, her eyes finding mine across 30 feet of concrete and strangers and the invisible barriers that usually prevent people from truly seeing each other. That was when the whisper returned. Not yet. I had heard the voice since childhood, though heard was not quite the right word. It did not arrive through my ears, did not vibrate against my eardrums, did not travel through the physical channels that sound normally uses to make itself known to consciousness. It simply appeared, in the space between thoughts, in the pause between heartbeats, in the silence that exists at the center of every moment, the silence that most people never notice because they are too busy filling it with noise and distraction and the endless internal monologue that humans use to convince themselves they understand what is happening to them. The voice was not loud. It did not need to be. True authority never announces itself with volume because things that are certain have no need to shout. They simply wait, knowing that time itself will eventually bend toward them, the way all rivers eventually find their way to the sea, the way all falling objects eventually reach the ground, the way all stories eventually reach their endings, whether the characters within them are ready or not. Not often did the voice speak, only at moments that mattered. When my mother died, cancer, the slow kind, the kind that gives you time to say goodbye, but also time to watch someone you love become unrecognizable, time to realize that the person leaving you is already gone long before their body stops functioning. The voice had whispered, "This is how it begins." I hadn't understood what it meant then. When I avoided the accident that should have killed me, a truck running a red light, my foot pressing the brake half a second before my conscious mind registered the danger, some deeper part of me responding to information I couldn't have processed fast enough through normal channels. The voice had whispered, "You are being preserved." I hadn't understood that either. But now, standing on a rain-soaked platform watching a woman I had never met look back at me with recognition that predated our meeting, I heard the voice deliver its clearest message yet. You may love her. A pause, but you may not keep her. I didn't tell Alara about the voice, not on our first date, which happened 3 days after the platform. 3 days during which I found excuses to return to that station at the same time each evening. 3 days during which I told myself I was being ridiculous. 3 days during which the voice remained silent because silence was its way of confirming that I was moving in the direction it had always intended for me to move. She was there on the third evening, standing in almost exactly the same spot, as if she too had been returning, as if she too had felt the gravity that had formed between us, the pull that made staying away feel like fighting against physics itself. "You've been looking for me," she said when I finally crossed the platform to speak to her. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" She smiled, not the bright, uncomplicated smile of someone who hasn't yet learned how much the world can take from you, but the measured smile of someone who understands that joy is always borrowed, always temporary, always accompanied by an awareness of the cost that will eventually come due. Because I've been looking for you too, she said. And I don't know why. I don't know your name. I don't know anything about you, but I've been coming back here every night since Thursday because something told me you would be here. Something. She had heard it too. Maybe not the same voice. I would learn later that it spoke to her differently, through dreams rather than whispers, through images rather than words. But the same source, the same intelligence, the same prophecy that had been guiding us toward each other long before we were born. Not because it wanted us to be happy, because it needed us to love each other. And it needed us to love each other so that it could take one of us away. I didn't tell her about the voice on our first date, or our second, or our 10th. I didn't tell her during the nights we spent talking until dawn, learning the geography of each other's histories, mapping the landscapes of each other's fears and hopes, and the small private shames that people only reveal to those they trust with everything. I didn't tell her about the nights I woke up with dates carved into my memory that weren't mine. December 17th, April 3rd, September 22nd, dates that felt significant in ways I couldn't explain. Dates that the voice had planted in my consciousness like seeds that would eventually grow into understanding I wasn't ready to receive. I didn't tell her that every time she laughed, the prophecy grew louder. Not angry, not urgent, just more present, more insistent, like a parent patiently repeating instructions to a child who keeps pretending not to hear. Because love does that. Love convinces you that fate can be negotiated, that rules can be bent, that the forces governing the universe might make an exception for two people who found each other against impossible odds and decided to hold on despite the cost. Love fills you with a desperate, irrational hope that your story might be the one that ends differently, that your love might be the love that proves the prophecies wrong, that your devotion might be strong enough to rewrite the endings that were determined long before you drew your first breath. And fate hates being challenged. Fate does not negotiate. Fate does not bend its rules for love or hope or the desperate prayers of people who have finally found something worth keeping and cannot bear the thought of losing it. Fate simply waits, knowing that time is on its side, knowing that eventually, inevitably, the prophecy will be fulfilled, not because fate is cruel, but because fate is structure. Fate is architecture. Fate is the framework that holds reality together, and frameworks cannot make exceptions without collapsing. The second time the prophecy intervened, it did not whisper. It screamed. Alara and I had been together for exactly 37 days. I know it was exactly 37 because I had been counting, because some part of me understood that our time was limited and wanted to preserve every moment with the precision of a historian recording the final days of a civilization, when the mirrors started lying. It began subtly. So subtly that at first I convinced myself I was imagining things, that the stress of keeping secrets from the woman I loved was manifesting in visual distortions, that my mind was playing tricks on me because minds do that when they're carrying too much weight. My reflection hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, easy to dismiss as a trick of the light or a malfunction in my perception. My reflection in the bathroom mirror paused before copying my movement, as if it needed a moment to receive instructions, as if it were no longer directly connected to my body, but was instead being operated by something else, something that was slightly out of sync with the reality I inhabited. I raised my hand. The reflection raised its hand. But between my movement and its echo, there was a gap, imperceptible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, obvious to anyone who was, a tiny fracture in the relationship between cause and effect that should not have been possible, but was. Then time itself began to stutter. Not dramatically, no frozen moments, no visible temporal distortions, nothing that would have been visible to an outside observer, but in small ways that Alara and I could both feel, small ways that confirmed we were not imagining what was happening to us. When our hands touched, time paused for half a breath longer than it should have, a silence that stretched, a stillness that lingered, as if the universe were recalculating something it had not expected us to attempt, as if our contact was creating complications in systems we couldn't see. Clocks skipped seconds when we kissed, leaping forward in tiny increments that added up over days and weeks until we realized we had lost nearly an hour to these stolen moments, an hour that the universe had quietly removed from our timeline without explanation or apology. Streetlights flickered when we said each other's names, the electrical current stuttering in response to sounds that shouldn't have had any effect on physical systems, but clearly did, sounds that were creating interference in the fabric of reality itself. Alara noticed it before I did. Or rather, she acknowledged it before I was willing to, because I had been noticing, had been cataloging every anomaly with the desperate precision of someone who knows they are losing something but cannot bear to admit it, had been telling myself that there must be explanations, must be causes that science could eventually identify, must be some way to make sense of what was happening that didn't involve accepting the impossible. "Do you ever feel," she asked one night, her voice low and uncertain, the city lights bleeding through the window behind her like distant stars drowning in light pollution, "like something is counting us?" I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because laughter is what people do when they are terrified, but not ready to admit it. Laughter is the sound humans make when the truth arrives too early, when knowledge appears before they have built the internal structures necessary to contain it, when the universe reveals something they are not yet strong enough to face. "Counting us how?" I asked, already knowing what she meant, already hearing the echo of my own unspoken fears in her question. She didn't answer immediately. She never answered immediately when the thought scared her. She would pause, gather herself, choose her words with surgical care, as if language itself might punish her for being careless, as if saying the wrong thing might accelerate whatever process was already underway. "Like we're not supposed to exist at the same time," she said finally, each word placed deliberately, each syllable weighted with meaning she wasn't sure she wanted to convey. "Like we're an overlap, a mistake the universe made and is now trying to correct." That night, when she fell asleep against my chest, her breathing slow and steady, her body warm against mine, her presence the only thing that had ever made me feel like I belonged anywhere, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the prophecy unfold in my mind with the cold precision of something that had never loved and never needed to. "Two paths cannot remain open," it said. "One must close." I had always assumed the prophecy was about death. I was wrong. The dreams began a week later, not shared dreams, which would have been easier to dismiss as coincidence, as the romantic nonsense people cling to when they want to believe their connection transcends the ordinary mechanisms of consciousness, but synchronized dreams, identical down to the smallest detail, down to the way the air tasted metallic and wrong, down to the way the sky pulsed like a living thing, like something breathing, like something watching. In the dream, we stood together on a plane that stretched infinitely in all directions. No horizon, no landmarks, nothing to indicate where we were or how we had arrived there, just endless gray flatness beneath a sky that throbbed with colors that shouldn't exist, colors that hurt to look at, colors that felt more like sounds or emotions than wavelengths of light. And across that sky, written in letters made of light and bone and something older than either, was a single sentence: "One of you must remain." We woke at exactly the same moment, gasping, hearts racing in perfect unison, our bodies responding identically to terror that had followed us from sleep into waking, our minds still caught in the grip of a message that felt less like a dream and more like a verdict. For several seconds, neither of us spoke, because we both knew that if one of us broke the silence, the dream would solidify into something real, something irreversible. As if speaking about it would transform it from possibility into certainty, as if acknowledging what we had seen would give it power over us that it didn't yet possess. "Alara," I said finally, my voice already betraying me, already shaking with the weight of everything I had never told her, everything I had been carrying alone for fear that sharing it would make it true. "I saw it too," she whispered. "Didn't I?" I nodded. She didn't cry. That frightened me more than anything else. more than the dreams, more than the mirrors, more than the voice that had been guiding me toward this moment since before I could remember. Because Alara was someone who cried easily, who let her emotions flow freely, who considered tears a natural response to beauty and sorrow and the overwhelming reality of being alive in a world that offered so much to feel. For her to face this without crying meant she had already accepted something I was still fighting against. Instead, she smiled, the soft, resigned smile of someone who has just realized that the rules they were playing by never applied to them in the first place, that the game was rigged from the beginning, that the only choice available is not whether to lose, but how. "I think," she said, her voice steady in a way that made my chest ache, "that we're inside a prophecy." The room felt colder when she said it. Not metaphorically, literally colder, the temperature dropping several degrees, as if the universe itself had leaned in to listen, as if reality was responding to her acknowledgement with confirmation that yes, she was right, and yes, knowing changed nothing, and yes, the prophecy would proceed, regardless of whether they understood it or accepted it or fought against it with everything they had. We searched for answers the way desperate people always search, through forbidden books found in the back rooms of occult shops run by people who seemed to know more than they were willing to say, through encrypted archives buried in the deep web where researchers had documented anomalies too dangerous to publish through official channels, through half-deleted research papers written by minds that had clearly broken before finishing their conclusions, sentences trailing off mid-thought as if the authors had been interrupted by something they could not see, through audio recordings that ended abruptly with sounds that might have been screams or might have been something worse than screams, something that human vocal cords shouldn't have been able to produce. And slowly, piece by terrible piece, the truth emerged. The prophecy was not ancient. That was the first surprise, the first crack in the framework I had built to understand what was happening to us, the first indication that everything I had assumed was wrong. The prophecy did not come from some mystical past, did not originate in the dreams of shamans or the visions of prophets, did not descend from any divine source that humanity's religions had imagined. The prophecy was recursive. It came from the future. It looped backward through time, carrying information that had not yet been generated, enforcing rules that had not yet been established, shaping the past to ensure that certain events would occur or not occur so that the future could exist in the form it needed to exist. The future was not a destination. The future was an architect, and the architecture it was building required certain sacrifices, certain corrections, certain adjustments to the timeline that felt like cruelty from our perspective, but were simply maintenance from its own. We learned that some people, rare, statistically improbable, cosmically significant, were convergences. Their existence created focal points in the probability matrix. When they met certain other people, other convergences, other focal points, other nodes in the network of possibility that reality used to structure itself, timelines narrowed. Possibilities collapsed. Paths that had remained open suddenly closed, and paths that had been closed suddenly opened, and the entire landscape of what could be shifted dramatically in response to a meeting that might have seemed coincidental, but was in fact cosmically significant. Two such people falling in love was not tragic. It was catastrophic. Not for them, or not only for them, but for reality itself, for the systems that held existence together, for the architecture that the future was trying to build. When two convergences loved each other, when their paths intertwined too completely, they created an overlap, a redundancy in the system, a doubling of function that the universe could not sustain, a stress point that threatened to fracture if it was not resolved. "You're saying," Alara murmured one night as we sat surrounded by notes and symbols and diagrams that made my eyes ache if I stared at them too long, "that the universe doesn't care which of us disappears. Only that one of us does." "Yes," I said, and the word tasted like ashes in my mouth. "And love is the trigger." "Yes." "If we hadn't loved each other," she continued, her voice flat and analytical, the voice of someone who has moved past grief into something colder and more functional, "we would both remain. We would exist in parallel, unaware of each other, never creating the overlap that requires correction. That's what the research suggests. She reached for my hand anyway, her fingers interlaced with mine. Her skin was warm against my skin. And somewhere, in a dimension I couldn't perceive, the prophecy roared. Not with anger, because prophecies don't feel anger, but with recognition, with confirmation, with the satisfaction of something proceeding exactly according to plan. We had loved each other. The trigger had been pulled, and now the only question was which of us would remain when the correction was complete. The prophecy gave us a deadline, not a date. Prophecies are never that kind, never that specific, never willing to provide information that might be used to circumvent their conclusions, but a condition. The message arrived through the same channels the dreams had used, appearing not in words but in understanding, not in language but in knowledge that simply materialized in our minds as if it had always been there and we were only now noticing it. When the choice is made unconsciously, it said, the universe will choose for you. That was the cruelty of it. Not that one of us had to disappear. That was simply mechanics, simply the consequence of being what we were, simply the price of a love that should never have been allowed to form. But that the disappearance would occur whether we chose it or not. If we stayed together too long, if we continued loving each other without deciding who would remain, reality itself would intervene, erasing one of us not as punishment but as correction, not as violence but as maintenance, not as tragedy but as the simple resolution of a misalignment that could not be allowed to persist. The choice, in other words, was not whether someone would disappear. The choice was only whether that disappearance would be intentional or arbitrary, conscious or random, meaningful or meaningless. Then we decide, Alara said, her jaw set with determination that I recognized as the same determination she had shown when fighting for things that mattered, when refusing to accept outcomes that seemed inevitable, when proving over and over again that she was not someone who surrendered easily. I looked at her, at this woman who had become my future in a universe that refused to allow futures to be shared, who had become the reason I wanted to keep existing in a cosmos that was preparing to make existence impossible for one of us, and felt something inside me fracture quietly, irreparably. Not my heart, something deeper, something structural. No, I said. I decide. She shook her head, already understanding what I was about to say, already preparing her counter-arguments, already refusing to accept a sacrifice she hadn't consented to. You don't get to sacrifice yourself just because you heard the prophecy first. I do, I replied, because loving you was never forbidden. Keeping you was. The prophecy didn't forbid me from feeling what I feel. It only forbade the outcome, only forbade the timeline where both of us remain, only forbade the future where we grow old together and die in each other's arms. If someone has to disappear so that the other can remain, then let it be me. Let it be the one who knew from the beginning that this was coming. Let it be the one who loved you anyway. For the first time since the dreams began, Alara cried. Not quietly. These were not the gentle tears of someone processing manageable grief, but violently, her whole body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than lungs or diaphragm or any physical organ. Sobs that seemed to come from the same place the prophecy came from, the place where fate was decided and futures were written and love was catalogued as a variable to be managed rather than a force to be honored. And somewhere beyond the edges of time, beyond the mirrors that had started lying to us, beyond the clocks that skipped our seconds and the lights that flickered at our names, the prophecy listened, patient, eternal, waiting to see which of us would remain. The prophecy did not hurry us. That was its most merciless quality. Not its inevitability, not its absoluteness, not even its requirement that one of us cease to exist so that reality could maintain its coherence, but its patience, its willingness to wait, its understanding that true inevitability does not need to rush because time itself will eventually bend toward it the way all rivers bend toward the sea. Days passed, then weeks, and in that suspended interval, between knowing and losing, between loving and choosing, we existed in a state that was neither peace nor panic, but something far more corrosive. A fragile normality stretched over an abyss. A routine performed on the edge of a cliff, a life lived in the shadow of an ending that refused to announce itself, but also refused to withdraw. We still drank coffee in the mornings. I learned how she liked hers, strong, with too much sugar, served in a mug that had belonged to her grandmother and was chipped in 3 places, but which she refused to replace because replacement would mean accepting that things could be lost, and she was not ready to accept that. Not about the mug, not about anything. We still argued about meaningless things. Which song was playing too loudly? Whether the window should be open at night. Who had forgotten to buy groceries, and who was responsible for the growing collection of takeout containers in the refrigerator. Normal arguments. The kind of arguments that couples have when they are secure enough in their love to waste energy on trivialities, when they trust that the foundations are solid enough to support the weight of minor disagreements and temporary irritations. We argued as if we had forever. We knew we didn't. We still laughed. And every time we did, every time joy escaped us, despite everything we knew, the sound felt stolen, borrowed from a future that no longer belonged to us, like happiness taken on credit with an interest rate paid in dread, like pleasure that would eventually have to be returned with compound sorrow added. But the world around us was beginning to react. The anomalies that had started small, mirrors hesitating, time stuttering, lights flickering, were growing, spreading, intensifying. People forgot conversations they had just finished with us, their faces briefly empty, their eyes briefly vacant, as if reality itself was erasing excess information to preserve coherence, as if the universe was already beginning the correction and was simply testing its tools, calibrating its methods, preparing for the larger erasure to come. We would be talking to a shopkeeper, purchasing groceries, engaging in the kind of small talk that fills the spaces between significant moments, and mid-sentence the shopkeeper would pause, frown, look at us with confusion that bordered on alarm. "I'm sorry," they would say. Were we talking about something?" And we would realize that whatever we had said in the last 30 seconds had already been removed from their memory, had already been edited out of their experience, had already been sacrificed to the growing instability that our love was creating. The prophecy was already working, not violently, not dramatically, but efficiently, with the quiet, methodical precision of a surgeon removing a tumor, careful to minimize damage to surrounding tissue, careful to preserve as much healthy matter as possible while eliminating the growth that threatened the larger system. We were the tumor, or one of us was, and the surgery had already begun. One evening, as the sky bruised itself into twilight, purple and red, and the particular shade of orange that only appears when the sun is dying and knows it's dying and wants everyone to watch, Elara stood in front of the bathroom mirror and did something that made my breath stop in my chest. She reached out. Her reflection did not. For a moment, only a moment, but long enough to fracture certainty, long enough to confirm that the rules we had always taken for granted no longer applied, the woman in the glass looked back at her with an expression that was not recognition but assessment. Not the passive mimicry that reflections were supposed to perform. Something else, something ancient and impersonal, something evaluating a problem it had solved many times before. Then the reflection smiled. Not Alara's smile, not the warm, slightly crooked expression that appeared on her face when she was genuinely happy, not the measured half-smile she used when she was being polite, not any of the variations I had cataloged in my months of loving her. A thinner smile, a knowing one. A smile that said, "I understand something you haven't figured out yet, and I am patient enough to wait for you to catch up." "You see it too, don't you?" she asked quietly without turning around, her voice carrying the flatness of someone who has moved past surprise into something colder. "Yes," I said. I had been standing in the doorway, watching her, feeling the temperature in the room drop, feeling the pressure change the way pressure changes before a storm, feeling reality itself reacting to what was happening in front of us. The reflection spoke. Not aloud. Mirrors don't speak. Reflections don't have voices. The physical laws that govern our universe don't permit glass to generate sound. But directly into the space behind my eyes, into the part of the mind where language forms before it becomes speech, where understanding exists before words are assigned to contain it. The overlap is destabilizing. A pause. Correction will occur. Alara pressed her palm against the glass, and this time the reflection pressed back, perfectly aligned, perfectly synchronized, mocking us with a demonstration of how alignment was supposed to work, how reflection was supposed to function, how reality was supposed to behave when it wasn't being distorted by the presence of two people who shouldn't exist simultaneously. "Tell us how," she said, her voice steady in a way that broke my heart, because steadiness in the face of cosmic horror required a detachment from hope, and detachment from hope meant she had already begun the process of accepting what I was still fighting against. "Tell us how one of us disappears." The reflection tilted its head, a movement Alara wasn't making, a deviation from the mirroring that should have been impossible but wasn't, and its eyes softened, not with kindness, with inevitability. The way a doctor's eyes soften when delivering a terminal diagnosis. The way an executioner's eyes soften just before the blade falls. "There are many methods," it replied, its voice still appearing directly in our minds, bypassing our ears entirely. "Memory erosion, temporal displacement, existential reassignment. The gradual removal of all evidence that a person ever existed, the systematic editing of reality to accommodate their absence, the careful adjustment of every mind that ever knew them so that the knowing becomes unknowing." I felt sick. "And which one applies to us?" I asked. The reflection tilted its head again, considering the question as if it were genuinely novel, as if we were presenting it with a problem it hadn't already solved countless times before. "The one you choose without realizing you've chosen." A pause. "Stop here," it added, the phrase appearing in my mind with additional weight, additional emphasis, as if these words were more important than the others. "Stop here, while you still can, while the choice remains yours rather than the universe's, while disappearance can still mean something rather than simply happening." Then the reflection resumed its normal behavior, mimicking Alara perfectly, copying her movements with the instantaneous precision that physics demanded, as if the conversation had never occurred, as if the warning had never been delivered, as if we were still living in a reality where mirrors were just mirrors and reflections were just reflections, and the future wasn't reaching backward through time to correct the mistakes the present was making. We lay tangled together in the dark, listening to the building creak and sigh around us, listening to the sounds of a world that didn't know what was happening in this small apartment, that had no idea two people were lying awake, counting the heartbeats they had left together, measuring the breaths they might never share again. "Alara," I whispered, tracing the line of her shoulder with my fingertip, committing the shape of her to memory with a desperation that bordered on ritual, as if remembering her hard enough might prevent her from being forgotten, as if my love might serve as an anchor, keeping her attached to a reality that was preparing to release her. "If you stay, promise me you'll forget gently." She turned to face me in the darkness, her eyes catching what little light filtered through the curtains, reflecting it back with an intensity that made my chest ache. "If I stay," she said, "it means you're gone." "Yes. And if you're gone," she continued, her voice cracking slightly on the words, "then the version of me that remains won't be me. It'll be a survivor-shaped thing pretending to be whole. It'll be someone wearing my face and speaking with my voice, but missing the part of herself that loved you, because how can I be complete when the most important part of my story has been erased?" I had no answer for that. Love, I was learning, does not always offer solutions. Sometimes it only clarifies the shape of the wound. Sometimes it only illuminates the exact dimensions of what will be lost, the precise contours of the absence that is coming, the specific architecture of the grief that will remain after everything else has been taken. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted. "I don't know how to choose. I don't know how to accept that one of us has to disappear so the other can remain. I don't know how to measure the value of my existence against the value of yours and declare a winner." "There is no winner," Alara said. "That's what makes it impossible. The prophecy isn't asking us to compete. It's asking us to collaborate in our own destruction. It's asking us to participate in an outcome that neither of us wants, to choose an ending that feels like failure no matter which way it goes." "Then maybe we don't choose," I said. "Maybe we refuse. Maybe we stay together and let the universe do whatever it's going to do. You heard what the reflection said. If we don't choose, the universe chooses for us, and the universe won't consider meaning. The universe won't factor in which of us has more to live for, or more to offer, or more love left to give. The universe will just correct, the way a computer corrects an error, the way a body fights an infection, efficiently, impersonally, without any consideration for what's being destroyed. We lay in silence for a long time after that, holding each other, feeling the weight of seconds passing, feeling time itself becoming precious in a way it never had been before, feeling the future pressing down on us with the gravity of everything we were about to lose. There has to be another way, I said finally. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying to both of us. There was no other way. There was only this way. There was only the choice, or the absence of the choice, and either path led to the same destination. One of us remaining, one of us gone, and love becoming a memory that might not survive the correction. The choice arrived the next morning, disguised as kindness. I woke to find Alara already dressed, standing by the window with the light outlining her like a memory already halfway faded, like a photograph someone had found in an attic and couldn't quite place, like something beautiful that was already beginning to blur around the edges. "I figured it out," she said before I could speak, her voice carrying a calm that didn't match the words, a peace that didn't belong to someone discussing the end of everything they had built. Fear settled into me with a cold, crystalline certainty, the kind of fear that arrives when you realize the conversation you're about to have has already reached its conclusion, that the person in front of you has made a decision without you, that the choice you thought you had has already been taken away. "The prophecy doesn't care who remains," she continued, still looking out the window, still backlit by morning, still beautiful in a way that made me want to freeze this moment forever, to stop time by force of will, to refuse to let the next seconds arrive because I knew they would contain something I couldn't bear. "But it does care about continuity." I sat up slowly, my heart already pounding, my body already responding to danger my mind hadn't fully processed yet. "What do you mean?" She turned, and there was a serenity on her face that did not belong to the present moment, a peace that seemed to have been imported from some future where the difficult thing had already been done and she had survived the doing of it, a calm that could only exist in someone who had already accepted what I was still desperate to reject. "If one of us disappears violently," she said, her voice measured and clinical, the voice of someone explaining physics rather than tragedy, "reality destabilizes. There's backlash, fractures, echoes. The universe doesn't just remove the person, it has to remove all evidence of them, all memories of them, all effects they ever had on anything, and that kind of wholesale revision creates cascading failures, tears in the timeline, damage that might never fully heal." "And if it happens quietly?" I asked, already knowing the answer, already feeling the shape of her plan forming in the space between us. She nodded. "Then the universe barely notices. If one of us chooses to fade, not disappear, not vanish, but gently release our grip on existence, the correction can happen smoothly. No damage, no echoes, no scars on reality that might cause problems later." I stood, my body moving before my mind gave permission, my legs carrying me toward her, because proximity was all I had left. Closeness was the only protest available to me. "No," I said, "whatever you're thinking, no." She crossed the room and placed her forehead against mine, the way she always did when she wanted to speak without words, when she wanted to communicate through touch and presence and the electricity that still crackled between us, despite everything. "You love me," she said. "Yes." "And you would sacrifice yourself for me." "Yes." "Then let me do the same," she whispered, her breath warm against my face, her presence so solid and real that I couldn't imagine a universe without her in it. But in a way that hurts less, in a way that doesn't tear reality apart, in a way that leaves you whole enough to keep living. "Alara, you heard the reflection," she interrupted. "Stop here." That's what it said. That's what the prophecy is asking for. Not violence, not tragedy, just an ending, a quiet ending. A gentle closing of one path so the other can remain open. "I won't let you. You can't stop me," she said, and the gentleness in her voice was worse than anger would have been, worse than argument, worse than anything except the terrible truth she was speaking. That's the part you haven't accepted yet. You can't save me. You can't sacrifice yourself in my place. All you can do is let me go, gracefully, gratefully, and remember what we had while you still can. She kissed me, and in that kiss, slow, deliberate, unbearably gentle, I felt something detach. Not pain. Not yet. Pain would come later when the full weight of loss arrived, when the absence became permanent, when I learned to navigate a world that no longer contained her. What I felt in the moment was simpler and worse, a thinning, a reduction. As if reality itself had decided which of us was extra, which of us was surplus, which of us would be removed to restore balance to a system we had destabilized simply by loving each other. The room flickered around us, not the lights but reality itself, existence stuttering like a video with buffering problems, the universe struggling to process the change that was beginning to occur. My name stuttered in her mouth when she tried to say it again, the sound catching, distorting, slipping out of alignment with meaning, the syllables that had always referred to me, now uncertain what they were referring to. "What's happening?" I asked, though I already knew, though the answer was written in the way she looked at me, with love still, with recognition still, but with something else now too, something that looked like confusion, something that looked like the beginning of forgetting. She stepped back, and I saw it on her face, the bloom of uncertainty spreading like a stain, the familiar gradually becoming unfamiliar, the person she had loved becoming a stranger one neural pathway at a time. She paused, searching for something she had lost. I was talking to someone. My chest tightened so hard I thought my ribs might crack. "Who?" I asked softly, hoping the sound of my voice might anchor her, might remind her, might reverse the process that had already begun. She frowned, her eyes scanning my face, as if trying to match it to a memory that was already blurring, already fading, already being edited out of her personal history. "I don't know," she said. The prophecy did not announce its victory. It never did. It simply adjusted, quietly, efficiently, with the precision of a system correcting an error it had been designed to correct, doing exactly what it was built to do, without malice or triumph, or any of the emotions that humans project onto, forces they cannot control. By evening, she could no longer remember my name. I would say it, speak the syllables that had referred to me for my entire life, and watch her face remain blank, unresponsive, as if I were speaking a foreign language she had never learned. By nightfall, she could no longer remember my face unless she looked directly at me. If I stepped out of her line of sight, even for a moment, even to reach for something across the room, I would return to find her startled, confused, looking at me the way you look at a stranger who has somehow appeared in your home. "Do I know you?" she asked once, and the question hit me with physical force, with actual weight, with the kind of impact that leaves bruises invisible to everyone except the person who receives them. "Yes," I said, "you know me." "I feel like I should," she replied, frowning at a feeling she couldn't explain. "There's something familiar, something I can't quite." But the sentence never finished, the memory never formed. The familiarity slipped away like water through open fingers, and she was left looking at me with polite confusion, the expression you give a stranger who seems to expect something from you that you cannot identify. I stayed. I watched. I loved her quietly, carefully, knowing that every second I remained near her was erasing me further, knowing that my presence was being edited out of her story with every moment that passed, knowing that the person she had been, the Alara who had loved me, who had chosen me, who had decided to fade so that I could remain, was already gone, replaced by a version of herself who had never known me at all. The final mercy was that when I vanished completely, she would not grieve. Not because she didn't love. She had loved me more than I had ever believed anyone could love me, had loved me enough to sacrifice her own existence so that mine could continue. But because the universe had edited me out of the version of her that remained. No grief, no loss, no memory of what we had been to each other. Just a woman standing in an apartment she had always lived in alone, feeling occasionally, in quiet moments, in the spaces between thoughts, that something was missing, that something important had been lost, that somewhere in the architecture of her consciousness there was a gap where something precious used to be. The last thing she said to me, standing in the doorway of her bedroom, puzzled, apologetic, looking at me with the careful politeness you reserve for strangers you suspect you should recognize, was this: "I'm sorry," she said, and the words were genuine, the sorrow real, even though she couldn't name what she was sorry for. "I feel like I lost something important, but I don't know what." I smiled. Not because I was happy. I would never be happy again, not in the way I had been happy with her, not in the way that comes from being truly known and loved by someone who sees all of you and chooses to stay. But because she had asked me to forget gently, and smiling was the only gentle thing I had left to offer. "That's okay," I replied. "You were never meant to remember." And somewhere beyond mirrors and time and choice, beyond the systems that maintained reality and the prophecies that enforced its rules, beyond everything I understood and everything I would ever understand, the prophecy closed one path. Not with cruelty. Prophecies are not cruel. Cruelty requires intention, requires a desire to harm, requires the kind of emotional investment that cosmic systems do not possess. Not with malice. Malice requires hatred, and the prophecy did not hate us. It didn't feel anything toward us, couldn't feel anything, existed in a realm where feeling was as irrelevant as color is to the blind. But with precision, with efficiency, with the calm, methodical thoroughness of a system completing its designated function, doing exactly what it was designed to do, correcting exactly what it was designed to correct. One remained, one disappeared. And love was neither punished nor rewarded. It was simply corrected, adjusted, made to fit within parameters it had briefly exceeded. I walked out of Alara's apartment that night, knowing I would never return, knowing that even if I did return, she would not know me, knowing that the woman I loved was gone, not dead, not destroyed, just edited, just revised, just overwritten with a version of herself that had never experienced the most important thing that had ever happened to her. The streets were quiet. The city moved around me with its usual indifference, cars passing and people walking, and the endless machinery of civilization continuing its operations without any awareness that something fundamental had just been lost, that somewhere in its midst a love story had reached its ending, and the ending was not happy, was not meaningful, was not any of the things that endings are supposed to be. Just quiet, just final, just over. I stopped at a bridge over the river and watched the water flow beneath me, dark and cold and endlessly moving, carrying whatever it carried toward destinations I would never see. "Stop here," the reflection in the window had said, and I had. Too late to save her. Too late to save myself. But exactly on time to learn what prophecies really cost, what love really risks, what fate really means when it decides that two people cannot exist in the same timeline, and one of them must go. Years passed. They do that, whether you want them to or not. Time continues its relentless forward motion, regardless of grief, regardless of loss, regardless of the desperate wish that some moments could last forever and others could be undone. I never stopped loving her. How could I? She had given up her existence so that I could keep mine. She had chosen to fade so that I could remain. She had loved me enough to let herself be erased, to accept a correction that removed her from my memory rather than removing me from the world. But she never remembered me. I checked. I went back to that apartment. Once, only once, because more than once would have been cruelty to both of us, and watched her through the window as she moved through rooms we had once shared, as she lived a life that had no space in it for the person she had loved most. She seemed happy, or if not happy, at least content, stable in a way she hadn't been when we were together, untroubled by the anomalies and distortions that our love had created, free from the weight of knowing that reality itself had marked her for correction. The universe had given her peace. The universe had taken me from her and given her peace in exchange. And I stood in the shadows across the street, watching her through glass, loving her from a distance that could never be closed, remembering what she could not remember, carrying what she no longer carried. That was my role now, not to be with her, to remember her, to hold the truth of what we had been in a consciousness that could still access it, to preserve the love that the prophecy had tried to erase, to be the witness that the universe had not managed to eliminate. She would never know. She would live her life believing she had always been alone, believing the gap in her heart was simply part of who she was, believing the occasional sadness that came without explanation was just the normal human experience of existence. But I would know. I would remember. I would carry the weight of a love that had defied prophecy and lost, a love that had challenged fate and been corrected, a love that had existed briefly and beautifully in a universe that couldn't afford to let it continue. Stop here, the prophecy had commanded, and we had stopped. But stopping didn't mean forgetting. Stopping didn't mean the end of love. Stopping only meant the end of being together. And love, I was learning, could survive separation the way fire survives the absence of fuel, burning on nothing but memory, consuming itself to keep existing, refusing to go out even when there was nothing left to burn. Refusing to go out. The last transmission came on a night like any other night, arriving through channels I didn't know I still had access to, appearing in my mind the way the prophecy's voice had always appeared, without warning, without fanfare, simply there. The correction is complete. A pause. Balance has been restored. A longer pause. The overlap has been resolved. I sat in my apartment, not our apartment, never our apartment, an apartment I had moved to because I couldn't bear to stay in places where her absence was too present, and listened to the voice deliver its final verdict. You loved, it said. You lost. This is not punishment. This is simply how the architecture functions. Two paths could not remain open. One was closed. The one that remained open, your path, continues. The other path, her path in relation to you, has been sealed. She continues to exist, but not for you, never again for you. This is the cost of convergence. This is the price of love between those who were meant to remain separate. The prophecy does not apologize. The prophecy does not explain beyond what has been explained. The prophecy simply closes. And then, the final words, delivered with something that might have been gentleness if systems like the prophecy were capable of gentleness. Remember her. That is what you were preserved for. That is why one of you remained. Not to continue living as if nothing happened. To carry the truth of what did happen. To be the witness. To be the memory. To be the proof that she existed, that she loved, that she chose to fade so that you could stay. Remember her. It is the only form of love still available to you. And it is enough. It has to be enough. Because it is all that remains. The voice faded. The connection closed. And I sat alone in an apartment in a city that didn't know what had been lost, holding a memory that no one else shared, carrying a love that no longer had an object, being the witness to a story that the universe had tried to erase. She was out there somewhere, living, breathing, not remembering me, and I was here, remembering her, carrying both of us forward, one remaining, one disappeared, and love, transformed now, reduced, corrected, continuing despite everything, continuing because continuing was all it could do. Continuing because love doesn't know how to stop, even when stopping would be easier, even when stopping would be kinder, even when stopping would be the only rational response to loss this total and silence this complete. Stop here, the prophecy had commanded, and I had stopped. But remembering never stopped. Remembering was forever. Remembering was the only eternity that remained available to those who had loved and lost and been left behind to carry the weight of what had been taken. And so I remembered, and I remember still. And I will remember until my own path closes, until my own correction comes, until the prophecy decides that my purpose has been served and my consciousness is no longer necessary for the systems that hold reality together. She loved me. I love her. And somewhere between those two truths, one past tense, one eternally present, exists everything that remains of a story the universe tried to erase. Not much, but enough. It has to be enough. Distromsets. In the space between loving and losing, where prophecies close and futures end, there waits a truth that survives correction. Love remembers what reality forgets. She faded so that he could remain. He remained so that she could be remembered. And somewhere between absence and presence, between the one who stayed and the one who was taken, love continues. Changed, reduced, but continuing. That is the final truth the prophecy permits. Not happily ever after. Not together forever. Just this. One remaining, one remembered, and the love between them lasting longer than the universe intended. Lasting despite correction. Lasting because love is the one thing that prophecies cannot fully control. Stop here, they commanded, and we stopped. But we never stopped loving. We never could. We never will.